futuristic, of imagining or anticipating something otherworldly. The future has been cancelled, and the hauntological aspect of this is that, ironically, to try to relive and recapture the disappearing hopes for the future, we return to the past, trying to rediscover how the future was imagined back then. Mark Fisher compares this, among other things, to the condition of Leonard in Christopher Nolan's movie Memento. Leonard suffers from anterograde amnesia. He has permanent memories up to a certain point in his life, but is incapable of making new ones. His only way of orienting himself with regards to changes in the world is through pictures, notes, and tattoos. Our cultural condition is like a collective anterograde amnesia, the inability to create new cultural forms, and thereby being doomed to orient ourselves to the same past again and again. Notice that even contemporary futuristic movies are mostly characterized by reviving the past, whether in repeating plots and themes already explored in blockbusters of past decades, or more explicitly adopting 80s aesthetics, referencing 80s culture, and creating soundtracks that imitate 80s analog synthesizers. You see it even in movie posters. TV shows, and even fellow YouTubers too, are following this trend through analog synth music and neon color schemes popularized in the 80s. There seems to be an increasing amount of music videos that try to hauntingly relive the old, being shot on VHS cameras or edited to look grainy. It seems like we have become more excited about reliving the past than imagining new futures. We are more interested in the aesthetics we are able to imitate and revive rather than the aesthetics we can create. It is seen in video games too, for example, in the resurgence of pixel art and chiptune music in indie games. This reaches a certain kind of paradox. The newest kinds of technology end up being used to recreate and imitate old kinds of technology. The recent movie Ready Player One takes place in the future, yet in its most important moments and aspects it simply replays the past, both on the level of form and content. The movie's virtual world, Oasis, is an amalgamation of past cultural icons, such as Godzilla, the DeLorean from Back to the Future, or the Iron Giant, and it is notable that the characters even return to the set of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. As Mark Fisher points out, the hotel in The Shining is explicitly hauntological. One door leads into a ballroom playing 1920s pop music, while another reveals a young woman whose body suddenly becomes old and decaying. The Shining is a movie about the past using us to repeat itself, and the characters of Ready Player One revisiting this architecture of haunting makes it doubly hauntological. Although Ready Player One's virtual world is presented as unreal, it is not very different from ours, populated by cultural references to the past that have been taken out of their old contexts and placed in spaces that are repeatable and replicable. It is no accident that in the past decade we have seen the emergence of new genres like vaporwave and hypnagogic pop, which are inherently characterized by a feeling of returning to the past. Vaporwave is created by sampling 80s and 90s pop songs, movie soundtracks, and commercials, and slowing them down, looping them, splicing them in different ways, and adding reverb. As strange as this genre might have seemed when it first came into prominence, it perfectly reflects our cultural condition as seen by Mark Fisher. Our cultural development has slowed down, perhaps even started looping indefinitely, repeatedly letting the past return. This condition constitutes a grand and looming atmosphere that we can't get out of. In the case of Vaporwave, new technologies, such as accessible audio workstation software and the internet that allows the music to spread like never before, is subordinated to the looping and repetition of the sounds of the past. Ready Player One is no different in this aspect. Its cutting-edge visual effects and computer-generated imagery are entirely subordinated to the demands of past cultural forms. Don't get me wrong here, I'm not denouncing all media that does this. There is clearly something appealing, something cool about the aesthetics that are being revived. But the important question is, why do we find them so appealing? Why now? The point of Fisher's analysis is not just to criticize culture characterized by lost futures, but to ask what these trends are a symptom of, and what they say about our current condition. Is this trend of nostalgia an accident? Or are we, as Fisher believed, part of a culture that, because of the condition it has found itself in, can only find appeal in pre-established cultural modes, in repetition, in rehashes, in caging ourselves in the safety of the familiar? The correlate of a future that will not arrive is a past that won't disappear. The past cultural forms that will not let us move on are like the rooms of the video game worlds. In the 90s, this was a popular online multiplayer game, but over the years became almost completely abandoned. If Worlds was a material structure, it would be falling into ruins, but its digital nature prevents it from ever decaying. A structure that cannot decay is a structure that cannot provide space for new structures. The eerie result is an architecture that is clearly outdated but unchanging, dragging behind the present. A world stuck in time. For Fisher, this is our world. I'd like to thank my Patreon supporters: Kelly Rankin, John Drum, Derek Andres, Yvonne, Jinsu An, Gibbering Idiot, Jamie Street, Carrie, Juan Chavez, Timur Mar, Numu, Andrew Burns, Michael Doherty, D. Lang, Sina B, Isabel Abdulali, Robert Phillips, Adam Johns, Baba Golshahi, Tendies123, John Beatles, Susie O, and Industrial Robot. I'm sorry for any names I mispronounced, but thank you for watching.
What is it bad news we already know is that the dimension of the future has disappeared. That in some ways that we're marooned, we're trapped in the 20th century still. That what is it to be in the 21st century is to have 20th century culture on higher definition screens.
There is arguably no greater contemporary articulator of our new humanity, newer forms of social organization, subjective feelings, varied nostalgic emotions than Mark Fisher. Coming from his first groundbreaking work, Capitalist Realism, he was able to presciently articulate prior theory in an easy-to-understand package that deeply resonated with many. In Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher was able to synthesize a ton of 20th century philosophy as to elaborate on our current state of things. He describes a state of realism, what he calls capitalist realism, as a current state of our new rigid neoliberal economic order, parameters purely within the scope of capitalism. As being Western subjects past the tides of 1980s emergent neoliberalism, capitalist realism can be seen as a state of such heavy, massive ideological atmosphere that we couldn't possibly imagine a world outside of capitalism, even for the largest critics of it. Fisher designates our new being as a purely business ontology, an almost new sociological metaphysics, a core state of innate being that purely revolves around business. Nothing can be abstracted or separate from capital. Our hobbies, interests, philanthropy, never truly separate from a rigid system of pure monetary-based productivity. Mark Fisher's first work, Capitalist Realism, encompasses the quotation, "It is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism," a quotation attributed to Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek. But after the successes of Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher moved to different writing avenues, ones that explored the human and artistic consequences of this capitalist realism. He details some newer subjective states that are emerging, newer states of depression and nostalgia. He explains these states through the ideas and lenses of hauntology and lost futures. As confusingly weird as hauntology and lost futures may sound, we'll get to the root of them and the newer forms of Fisher's continental thought. And as much as Ghost of My Life is about hauntology and lost futures, it's also about Mark Fisher as a person, his personal experiences, his analysis around certain forms of art and popular culture. As many of you know, I'm a huge fan of Mark Fisher, and his ideas resonate with me better than most theorists I have read. For that, I'm super excited to get this video going. This is Mark Fisher's Ghost of My Life, just in video form. Before we really get moving, it's important to note, especially to viewers who are interested in reading Mark Fisher's second major work, Ghost of My Life, that this book is quite different from his first book, Capitalist Realism. Ghost of My Life starts with his core theory around a new synthesis of hauntology and his theory of lost futures. Then it moves into personal art theory and criticism, As examples of this hauntology and lost futures, he brings up artists like Joy Division, James Blake, and old British film. And while we will not reach every artistic example he brings up, we will try to get at the totality of the points Fisher is making throughout. This brings us to what Mark Fisher considers the slow cancellation of the future. Of course, the question is, what the hell does he mean by this? What Mark Fisher ultimately means here is that the way we experience artistic time periods are dying as we speak. In our current state of this new postmodern social existence that we see in the West, historicity is gone. The way we interact and experience time is starting to fade away into a confused, jumbled mess of aesthetic chaos. Einstein, physics, and relativity may be able to give us an objective scientific basis of time, but that objectively doesn't relate to our internal subjective experience in many ways. We interact with time with art, with popular culture, and a purely scientific approach to time doesn't get at the core ways in which we subjectively interact with it as a conception. Fisher sees this subjective time as something phenomenological, and one way of making sense of our reality is relating certain art back to a specific time period. With music, the 1970s was marked by a new emergence of rock that pulled deeply from American blues and psychedelic tonal bleedovers. The 1980s was a newer marking of hair bands and reflective of newer musical use of instruments like synthesizers, and a popularization of new technologies such as oscillators, the main electrical component in a synthesizer that generates sound. The 1990s was marked by a newer grunge, garage band, and small revivals of rock sounds seen in the 1960s and 70s. We can hear music in any one of these historical time periods and recognize its placement and pattern within it. We know that Led Zeppelin is from the 70s, Bon Jovi is from the 80s, and Nirvana is from the 90s. But today, everything is a wild mishmash of these periods. It's not really anything new or wildly different. While the musical jump from the 70s to the 80s was very noticeable, these patterns in which we subjectively conceptualize time periods is now getting to a point where we really can't conceptualize anything truly new or original. Thus, the future is suspended in time. The future is canceled. But like capitalist realism, there is a material economic reason for this, and a reason this is happening now, rather than, say, the mid-20th century. We are in an era of neoliberal market fundamentalism, especially in places like the West. In the United States, art has always been a commodified entity, but the neoliberal revolution really changed the extent of that. Mark Fisher talks about how, during the age of social democracy, Britain funded art programs, film centers, and the result were experimental classics such as Sapphire and Steel, and an era of extremely artistic British TV, seen with shows like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Fisher makes some commentary on social democracy, age of union solidarity, a much more robust and deep middle class, a government with tangible welfare programs that helped many. Fisher talks about how social democracy may not be as tangibly good as we romantically remember it, as this romanticizing exists mainly on how problematic and rough the state of things are today. But one extremely prescient marking of social democracy was a sublime form of artistic solidarity as well, a world where there was a sublime value around art, a realization of something so critically important that we couldn't just simply sacrifice it on the whims of the market. Contrast this today, the pretty much global death of social democracy in favor of raw market fundamentalism, we see that art had to make a change.
It's the slow cancellation of the future. The slow cancellation of the future, I think, which captures not only that sense of termination, but the gradual nature of it. Of course, it's not that the future in culture disappears overnight. It withers. It drains away. But it's, at least in terms of music culture and in the UK context, I think we can say that this waning, this disappearance, this cancellation of the future started to become evident about a decade ago. Our expectations have declined, and this flattening out of time has become more naturalized. I don't think we anymore expect music to sound like a radical break from the past.
It was, in fact, sacrificed to market functions, even in the public sphere, as nearly all public funding for art was ransacked. The result is a hyper-commodified sphere of art, where the primary goal is now making a profit, not necessarily out of pure love of profit, but the realization that your ability to be an artist will die without tangible sales. Thus, we see a recycling of old art, as creating truly new works of art is just not profitable enough, not quick enough to make, and takes too much time to pull in profitable growth. Thus, we see a recycling of music, TV, film, and even video games. And the consequence of this is that, conceptually, the future is now dead. There is no tangible future to our experience within art. It's now a plane of purely recycled creation. And what spawns from this death of the future is the very hauntology Mark Fisher talks about. Now, before we enter the realm of hauntology, we must understand a little bit about its theoretical origins. Hauntology was an idea derived from Jacques Derrida in his book Spectres of Marx. Derrida theorized that within certain narratives, philosophies, ideas, there can exist these fissures, remote holes of prior philosophy that come back and show themselves, even though their immediate relevance may be surpassed. In Derridian terminology, they haunt the present. There is a reason hauntology sounds like ontology. Ontology being a philosophical field pertaining to raw existence, how you exist, what things actually exist in reality. Hauntology plays on this existence as something that exists and transcends time, moves from the past into the present, as a ghost that haunts it. Thus, a hauntology. As according to Derrida, Marxism tends to haunt Western society from beyond the grave. Derrida's Spectres of Marx was published in 1994, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the official end of tangible Marxism. But while Marxism may not have the same social referent as it once did, Derrida argues it's only stronger because of this. This is just a tiny overview around the origins of hauntology. Matter of fact, in Spectres of Marx, Derrida only mentions hauntology a couple times. If you are interested in Spectres of Marx specifically, you should go check out Plastic Pill's video on it. It's fantastic and one of the only ones on the topic on YouTube. Mark Fisher brings the focus of this hauntology towards art, media, and culture, but Mark Fisher spins it. He claims that this hauntology can be seen as a newer depressive state of nostalgia that we experience. We are haunted by these lost futures that never arrived. Things like socialism, emancipatory technology, a better world that was supposed to come, a world that was supposed to build off of the new art we saw in the 20th century, a world that was supposed to build off some emancipatory success of social democracy. Instead, we got a world that is in material degradation. From the newer movement towards neoliberalism, rigid austerity, a growing wealth divide between the poor and the rich, a destruction of labor organization, things that would radically change the trajectory of art.
Well, depends who you ask. Okay, so what's the simplest, what's the one categorical for me when it comes to music? It's, can I dance to it? Does it make me wanna dance? This does not yet, but it could. Maybe if we change a little bit. Has certain elements of being a complete mess embedded in it. Music. Well, depends who you ask. What's the one categorical for me when it comes to music? Can I dance to it? Does it make me wanna dance? Music. Well, essence of the woody grass. That's the one categorical for me when it comes to music. In against it. Does it make me want to Hello. What does this need? What does this need? To get you on your feet? Do you need some? Where would you start if you were to start? Hello. Hello. Where are you going? Simple. Sometimes it's simple. Sometimes it's not. Oh. Aha. Obviously this needs to be in all of them. Otherwise there's no point, huh? What's the point for you? What is the point for you? Oh, am I in the red? That's not very good. That's not very good. Why am I in the red? Anyway, where were we?
Music and media. The beginning of Ghosts of My Life operates as an explanation towards the new ideas Fisher is proposing, and the rest of the book gives concrete commentary around more personal examples in popular British culture and music that were prescient to Fisher's development. And as stated before, there are an absolute ton of artistic examples Fisher puts forth. We won't be able to cover every single piece of art and media in Fisher's second book, but we will dive into some of the ones that I find to be the most fitting for the book's theoretical narrative. Mark Fisher starts this section off with a return to the 1970s in popular culture. To Fisher, in retrospect, we can map the past and its trajectory into the present, and for the 70s, it was the beginning of the end. This brings us into Joy Division. To Mark Fisher, Joy Division, the British new wave punk band from the late 70s, was paramount at sculpting this new depressed tonality of our current times. Emerging in the late 70s, their music coincided with a future becoming officially foreclosed, the end of a time of public development, and the labor solidarity of the mid-20th century. To Fisher, in retrospect, their music represented not only the emerging material future of austerity, but a depressive state of future nothingness, the beginning of these very lost futures. The lead singer Ian Curtis seemed to echo this through his monotonous vocals, a sad monotony that would precede Curtis's suicide in 1980. This brings us into Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, a TV show that explores British spies and their attempt to uncover a Soviet mole in the middle of the Cold War. It explores territory of one's true character, lies, deceit, and national pride. The British main character, Smiley, uncovers things about Britain that make him question his faith, question the face of a world he once revered. But to Fisher, this is the marking of the 1970s, an age in which we enjoyed, but at a distance, distanced from the traumatic core that social democracy, prior society, may not have been as good as we thought it was, as it was still riddled with the socioeconomic beginnings of neoliberalism and at the height of geopolitical imperialism. Here, Fisher brings this hauntology into the form of celebrities in the 70s and Britain. From Mark Fisher's experience, people like Jimmy Savile, a popular DJ and businessman involved in child entertainment, is a great example of the traumatic core of the pop culture illusion of greatness, as Jimmy was guilty of sex abuse, the victims namely children, an abuser who was knighted and was a giant British celebrity. Fisher says that historical periods return, but not always as nostalgia, but as trauma. Yet, this trauma is continually hidden in plain sight. This moves us into Fisher's media and pop culture examples around hauntology, and it starts with rave culture and music in London, specifically around a category of dance called jungle, a style of dance music in the 90s that used dark ambient tones laced with sharp and bold beats in between. Fisher theorizes that the immediate popularity of this music was again a representation of historical melancholy, a dark melancholy that often invoked fear. Being in an abandoned factory during a rave, packed with people with this type of music, offered a fearful libidinal release. You are getting your fear out of the way here, rather than at the fear of job loss, the existential anxiety around a new society built around market fundamentalism. But this hauntology and the music that represents it isn't just fear, it has a vacuous texture to it. And Fisher talks about a number of contemporary projects that pay homage to this very jungle music. Musical projects that feel tamer, as a homage to jungle music of the past that predicted the present day of dead-end jobs, lack of careers, scarcity and austerity. But this new music is a dark textural nothingness, not of an active beating fear, but just texture. Fisher sees this new music as a representation of London's rainy streets in the height of a Britain ran by Tory neoliberalism. Fisher cites albums such as Burial and Theoretically Pure Anterograde Amnesia. The name alone, Theoretically Pure Anterograde Amnesia, seems so indicative of our postmodern world, one where history and time is blurred, as anterograde amnesia is the medical terminology around a state of being completely unable to learn and retain new information. Our current state of lost futures mirrors this phenomenon in a sociological sense, and for this ontological style of music, it shared the same melancholic themes throughout. This passage begins with this. Could it be said that we all now suffer from a form of theoretically pure anterograde amnesia? Oliver Sacks, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, and Christopher Nolan's Memento have made the features of this condition referred to misleadingly as short-term memory loss well known. In fact, sufferers do produce new memories, but they are not retained. There is no long-term encoding. This type of amnesia is anterograde rather than retrograde because it does not affect any memories formed before the onset of the condition. Theoretically, in practice, it is likely that even the old memories will undergo some degradation. On Theoretically Pure Anterograde Amnesia, the album, a tendency in the caretaker's music has reached a kind of culmination. The theme was once homesickness for the past. Now it is the impossibility of the present. Here Fisher brings in even more artistic and cultural examples, but in the context of what he refers to as a stain of place, a stain of new exterior existence. Contemporary architecture such as the 90s, fast construction strip mall centers, cheaper and newer facades constructed among classic, better, more artistically built architecture. A newer market brutalism that ironically inflates prices, skyrockets real estate prices, yet creates a drastically duller and more uninspiring environment. And since the 90s and the early 2000s, there has been a move towards a bit more inspiring modern architecture. We still experience the same inflating prices though, along with the upkeep of the dull, monotonous strip malls, ugly facades, etc. There's an emotional challenge to this. In urban areas, we will see these brutal architectural facades everywhere, with the more robustly creative facades in between the lines. These lines serve as a constant unconscious reminder of a world that once was. A nostalgia for better days. But more importantly, nostalgia for better days because of an objectively worse world today. It's important to note, there is a sequencing with Mark Fisher's first and second work. Capitalist realism lays a material foundation and cause for the effect of hauntology and lost futures. A monotonous world with a sociological emotion of melancholy, an often subconscious longing for artistic meaning, for meaning outside of pure business and exchange. There's a longing and wanted sense of a world where we can once again approach sublime forms of art, creation, and inspiration. And what has been shown to us is a world after neoliberalism, harsh market austerity, is that there is little hope for an artistic, creative future we once dreamed of. We have glimmers of creation between the lines, but even some of the more successful artistic creations today are channeled from the past. They often serve as a recycled homage to a world much more sympathetic to art, to music, to things that fundamentally make life worth living. Mark Fisher starts his book out by stating that these ghosts, these examples of pop media he puts forth, are personal to him, and that we cannot separate the personal from the political. In my mind, Mark Fisher's continual battle with depression and his tragic suicide in 2017 seem to be proof of the very real cultural conditions he sets forth in his books. And for that, there is a creative seriousness I take with these kinds of videos. With Ghost of My Life, his ideas around hauntology and lost futures, there is a subtext here. A subtext being that art, aesthetics, music are all things that deeply affect our psychological conditions in a larger sociological context. And these things are not something that should be taken lightly or sacrificed on the ideological and abstract whims of capital. Thank you all for making it to the end. Videos around Mark Fisher are always quite difficult for me to make given the pretty gritty nature of them. Of course, I have the same request. I truly couldn't do any of this without all the support on Patreon.
Thanks. Yeah, with that, we have come to the end of this this little exercise and song as well. I hope you enjoyed Mark Fisher, Ontology, a video by Epoch Philosophy, who I just sub to and I really couldn't do to say.